The chapel stood at the edge of the marsh where the land slumped, and the reeds hissed in a language older than prayer. Its stones were black with lichen, and its roof sagged like a lung drained of air. No bell rang when they arrived, and no door opened for them until the wind pushed it inward with a long, wet sigh. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, with the scent of salt and iron, as if the sea itself had crept up the aisles to watch. They walked without speaking, and the floor creaked beneath, their weight in a rhythm like a heartbeat. Candles burned low as if ashamed of their own light, their wax melting in thin strings that clung to the altar like veins. The windows were stained not with saints, but with shadows of nameless figures whose faces had been rubbed away by time. No name was carved above the doorway, only a symbol like a knot or a claw, and it seemed to shimmer when looked at too long. She wore no veil, only a dress of raw linen that dragged through the dust, picking up ashes. As it moved, he wore a coat older than he was, the lining eaten through by moths, the buttons engraved with crescents. Neither of them looked at the other, their eyes fixed on the cracked stone floor where lines of moisture traced symbols of their own. They were not accompanied by family nor friends, only a lone crow perched upon a beam, its feathers shaking though no draught touched it. When the priest appeared, he did not step out from a vestry, but from the wall itself, as if the stone had decided to take a human shape. His face was hidden by a hood of rotting velvet, and his hands were gloved, though the fingers twitched as if something inside was alive. He spoke no words at first, only inhaled deeply, as though tasting the air they brought with them from the outside. Then he whispered a string of syllables that sounded like a blessing, but felt like a curse scraping along the edges of the ears. She trembled, but did not flinch when he took her hand, his gloved thumb smearing a dark streak across her skin. The groom placed his palm over hers, and something pulsed between them, not warmth, not cold, but a sensation like sinking. From a hidden drawer beneath the altar, the priest drew out a quill, black as a spider's leg, and a book bound, in grey leather. He opened to a blank page and laid it before them, yet no inkpot stood nearby, only a small cup of liquid so dark it swallowed light. He guided their hands to the cup, and they dipped their fingers into it, not knowing if it was blood or something older. When they pressed their fingers to the page, the leather seemed to shudder, and their marks sank into it like teeth into flesh. No names were written, only a dark sigil curling like smoke that writhed as though alive. The crow let out a harsh cry above them, and its wings beat once, twice, stirring the candle flames, until shadows climbed the walls like vines. The priest closed the book with a sound like a door slamming far away. He gave no blessing, no kiss of peace, only traced the same sigil across his hood, and faded back into the wall as though drawn into stone. For a moment they stood alone before the altar, the candles guttering low, the windows whispering as the wind picked up outside. She turned to speak, but her voice broke in her throat, and he took her arm not gently but as if anchoring himself to her weight. They left the chapel without looking back, yet each step felt heavier, as if the floor wished to keep them. Outside, the marsh mist had thickened until the path was gone, and only the smell of salt and iron told them where they were. Somewhere behind them the crow cawed again, but when they glanced up, it was not a bird, but a shadow, with wings unfolding from the chapel roof. Its eyes were pale like milk, and it watched them without moving until the mist swallowed everything. She felt something cold on her finger, and looked down expecting a ring, but there was only a smear of the dark liquid that did not fade. He felt the same on his palm, a mark shaped, like the sigil burning without heat. Neither spoke as they walked into the marsh, their footsteps leaving no prints, and the reeds bending as though bowing. Above them the sky darkened, though no night had fallen, and the air hummed low, like a hidden choir holding a single endless note. At the edge of the marsh a sound rose behind them, the toll of a bell they had never heard ring before. When they turned, the chapel was gone, replaced by a black expanse of water, reflecting nothing but their own faces. Yet even that reflection was wrong, for in the water they stood not as two, but as one shape knotted at the hands, and as the ripples spread outward, something moved beneath the surface, rising slowly as if to meet them. They say a lineage can fold in on itself like fabric, rotting in a damp trunk, And in this village that folding began before memory itself, old women whispered of a family whose veins coiled back upon their own. A red spiral passed from cradle to cradle again. Their houses stood at the edge of the moor, their timbers blackened by salt wind, their shutters nailed shut even in summer. Every birth was greeted not with bells, but with the muffled toll of a hidden drum, as though the earth itself counted the arrival. Each child was born with eyes the color of ash after a funeral fire, and those eyes seemed to know too much. They would not cry when held to a priest's font. They would not open their lips to baptism, water as if tasting its cold betrayal. Midwives said they had to pry the infants apart from their mothers with fingers bleeding from the effort, and when the first breath came, it carried a sound more like a sigh than a sigh that made the candles in the room flicker backwards. In one attic, a woman sat weaving at a loom, though no thread lay on the shuttle. Her hands moved, as if pulling something invisible out of the air, something fine and red that glimmered only in the corner of the eye. She was the keeper of the family's memory, and the pattern she wove was their history, written not in letters but in veins. Each night she whispered names into the cloth, and each name became a knot tight and unbreakable. The villagers told their children never to look directly at the windows of that house at dusk. For sometimes a child's face would appear there, watching pale and still, its eyes like the ends of burnt matches. Sometimes two faces would appear, one behind the other, as if one body held more than one soul. Those who met those eyes carried a splinter of them in their dreams, waking with the taste of copper on their tongues. One winter, when the river froze solid, a stranger arrived, a traveling cleric with hands too clean and voice too bright. He spoke of cleansing, of genealogies, of cutting the thread that had looped upon itself for centuries. The family let him in, offered him bread that smelled faintly of salt and iron, and he prayed over the table as if to bless it. But when he looked into the cradle, he fell silent and his lips moved without sound, his eyes darting to the corners of the room. A child lay there, swaddled in grey cloth, its tiny hands clenched around something unseen. The cleric reached out, but the child's gaze fixed him like a pin, and he felt the blood retreat from his fingers. He turned and left before the bread cooled on the table, never crossing himself, never looking back. Outside, the villagers saw him stumble as though threads caught at his feet, until he vanished into the snow. The midwives still speak of the birth that followed that winter, a girl born with a red cord around her wrist, a cord that tightened when cut until it sank beneath her skin. They could not remove it, and so they wrapped her in black linen and carried her to the attic where the weaver waited. The woman took the child and held her close, whispering a name that no one outside the family had ever heard. That night the loom creaked, though no wind touched it, and the invisible thread shone bright enough to cast a shadow on the wall. The baby did not cry, but a thin line of red appeared on the cloth, where her name had been knotted. From that point, the villagers stopped speaking of the family at all, but still at dusk, they closed their shutters, and still in the cracks of the street a fine red dust gathered like ground brick, though no building had fallen. It is said if you walk the moor at night you may feel a single strand brush your cheek like a spider's silk. If you follow it, it will lead you to the attic window where a lamp burns without flame. Inside a cradle rocks on its own, and a loom moves with no hands, weaving names you have never spoken, and when you blink, you may find a thin red line across your palm as if something had tied you to them without asking. The lineage continued its inward spiral tighter and tighter until even memory seemed to fray. And yet the thread never broke, it only grew more luminous, more hungry for new names. The villagers waited for a time when it would finally snap, but each year the moor grew redder at the roots of the grass, and each year a child was born with eyes of ash and lips sealed against water. On the eve of the new century, the attic window opened. For the first time in decades, a gust of wind carried out not dust, but a ribbon of red so fine it vanished when touched. And somewhere in the darkness, a voice whispered a name that belonged to no living soul. When the villagers looked up, they saw the loom stop the cradle still, and the child inside open its eyes wide, and as it opened its mouth not to cry but to breathe, they felt the thread in their own blood shift as though tightening. The house rose from the edge of the moor like a warning, its gables pitched steep against the sky, and its windows like lidded eyes. Time had made its stones soft and green, but no ivy clung to it, as though even creeping plants feared its walls. Behind, the highest window, a pale curtain sometimes swayed, though no wind touched it, and on nights when the mist lay thickest, villagers swore they heard a woman's breathing above the roofline, slow and measured like a sleeper who will never wake. She had been brought there in a carriage without insignia. Its wheels muffled its horses black as coal. No one saw her face when she crossed the threshold, her head bowed under a veil of grey. Her dress was sewn from heavy cloth, meant for mourning, not for marriage, and it left a dark smear on the steps where she climbed. The door closed behind her with a sound like a sigh drawn back into a throat, and from that moment she was no longer seen in daylight. They called her the Attic Bride, because she never left the highest floor by day. The shutters stayed locked from the inside, their hinges rusted from salt mist. By night, a dim lamp burned behind the curtain, casting her silhouette upon the glass. But the villagers whispered that the shape was not hers alone, for when she moved, another shadow moved with her, slower, heavier, like a second pulse beneath the first. Servants claimed they carried trays up the stair and left them on the landing for hands that would appear from the darkness and take them without a word. Sometimes the hands were pale and slim as a maiden's, and sometimes they were larger, their knuckles like knots. Once a young scullery maid looked up and saw the door ajar, just enough to glimpse a figure in white standing before a mirror. Yet in the glass there stood two figures joined at the shoulder, though only one body faced her in the room. The house itself seemed to know she was there. Boards warped and groaned above the parlour ceiling as though weight shifted. Back and forth at odd hours, the chimney drew in cold air instead of smoke, carrying with it a smell of damp linen and old blood, and always a soft humming drifted down the stairs, a melody without words that turned the stomach when heard too long. Spent her days sewing, but not garments for herself. Long strips of fabric hung from the beams, like skins drying, each one marked with a symbol stitched in black thread. Sometimes the fabric twitched, as though something beneath it tried to move. Visitors spoke of seeing pale fingers reach out from between the strips and withdraw again like spiders retreating into cracks. When the wind blew from the sea, the attic window rattled and voices rose inside, not in argument, but in whispered repetition. It sounded like two people reciting vows in different languages, trying to find the same rhythm. She pressed her palms to the glass, leaving prints that stayed for hours, though the air was dry, and sometimes at dawn a second set of prints appeared beside. Hers larger, darker, as if burned into the pane. A local priest tried once to enter and climb to the attic to offer blessing or confession. He came out pale and trembling, his eyes fixed on nothing, his hands gripping the banister as though it were the only thing holding him to the world. When asked what he had seen, he muttered only that she was not alone and that the air up there felt like breathing underwater. He left the village that same night, walking until his boots split, never crossing. Himself again. Children dared each other to touch the house at dusk. Those who did returned with their fingers numb and a faint black line across their wrists like the mark of a cord. One boy swore he heard a cradle rocking, though no child had ever been seen there. Another said he smelled salt and iron, as if a tide had risen in the attic itself. Her story seeped into lullabies. Mothers warned their daughters never to follow a stranger in a grey carriage, never to wed without witnesses. Yet some nights the villagers found small offerings at their doors, a strip of cloth, a curl of dark hair, a needle threaded with black. They burned these gifts, but the smoke smelled of seaweed and left stains on the ceiling, like fingerprints. The years passed. But she did not age, at least not where anyone could see. The lamp behind the curtain burned the same weak glow, and the silhouette remained slender still, but the second shadow grew taller, broader, sometimes stooping, as though it carried weight upon its back. And once the curtain fluttered aside just enough to show a pale face looking down, expressionless, yet the eyes were two different colors, and neither belonged to her. On the eve of a winter storm, a loud sound came from the attic like wood, tearing, followed by a rush of cold air. The servants found the landing wet, as though something had spilled from within, though the door stayed locked. All night the lamp flickered faster than a heartbeat, and the humming turned into a low chant, a Dawn, the villagers saw a dark shape at the window pressed against the glass, as if begging release or offering a warning. Since that night, no light has burned in the attic, but at certain hours the curtain still stirs. And if you stand beneath the gable and listen, you can hear two breaths drawing in and out unevenly. Some swear they see a face at the window, veiled and pale, and behind it a hand rising as if to caress her hair. Others see only the shadow of a cord dangling like a noose swaying. Though no breeze moves, if you ever climb those stairs you may find the door unlocked and a mirror waiting. In it you might see yourself standing not alone, but with another shape leaning close, its lips at your ear. And before you can turn, you may feel a stitch pulled tight at your wrist, a black thread winding into your skin. The door will close behind you without a sound, and the attic will gain another bride. The house rose from the edge of the moor like a warning, its gables pitched steep against the sky, and its windows like lidded eyes. Time had made its stones soft and green, but no ivy clung to it, as though even creeping plants feared its walls. Behind the highest window a pale curtain sometimes swayed, though no wind touched it, and on nights when the mist lay thickest, villagers swore they heard a woman's breathing above the roofline, slow and measured like a sleeper who will never wake. She had been brought there in a carriage without insignia. Its wheels muffled its horses black as coal. No one saw her face when she crossed the threshold, her head bowed under a veil of grey. Her dress was sewn from heavy cloth, meant for mourning, not for marriage, and it left a dark smear on the steps where she climbed. The door closed behind her with a sound like a sigh drawn back into a throat, and from that moment she was no longer seen in daylight. They called her the Attic Bride, because she never left the highest floor by day. The shutters stayed locked from the inside, their hinges rusted from salt mist. By night, a dim lamp burned behind the curtain, casting her silhouette upon the glass. But the villagers whispered that the shape was not hers alone, for when she moved, another shadow moved with her, slower, heavier, like a second pulse beneath the first. Servants claimed they carried trays up the stair and left them on the landing for hands that would appear from the darkness and take them without a word. Sometimes the hands were pale and slim as a maiden's, and sometimes they were larger, their knuckles like knots. Once a young scullery maid looked up and saw the door ajar, just enough to glimpse a figure in white standing before a mirror. Yet in the glass there stood two figures joined at the shoulder, though only one body faced her in the room. The house itself seemed to know she was there. Boards warped and groaned above the parlour ceiling as though weight shifted. Back and forth at odd hours, the chimney drew in cold air instead of smoke, carrying with it a smell of damp linen and old blood, and always a soft humming drifted down the stairs, a melody without words that turned the stomach when heard too long. Spent her days sewing, but not garments for herself. Long strips of fabric hung from the beams, like skins drying, each one marked with a symbol stitched in black thread. Sometimes the fabric twitched, as though something beneath it tried to move. Visitors spoke of seeing pale fingers reach out from between the strips and withdraw again like spiders retreating into cracks. When the wind blew from the sea, the attic window rattled and voices rose inside, not in argument, but in whispered repetition. It sounded like two people reciting vows in different languages, trying to find the same rhythm. She pressed her palms to the glass, leaving prints that stayed for hours, though the air was dry, and sometimes at dawn a second set of prints appeared beside. Hers larger, darker, as if burned into the pane. A local priest tried once to enter and climb to the attic to offer blessing or confession. He came out pale and trembling, his eyes fixed on nothing, his hands gripping the banister as though it were the only thing holding him to the world. When asked what he had seen, he muttered only that she was not alone and that the air up there felt like breathing underwater. He left the village that same night, walking until his boots split, never crossing. Himself again. Children dared each other to touch the house at dusk. Those who did returned with their fingers numb and a faint black line across their wrists like the mark of a cord. One boy swore he heard a cradle rocking, though no child had ever been seen there. Another said he smelled salt and iron, as if a tide had risen in the attic itself. Her story seeped into lullabies. Mothers warned their daughters never to follow a stranger in a grey carriage, never to wed without witnesses. Yet some nights the villagers found small offerings at their doors, a strip of cloth, a curl of dark hair, a needle threaded with black. They burned these gifts, but the smoke smelled of seaweed and left stains on the ceiling, like fingerprints. The years passed. But she did not age, at least not where anyone could see. The lamp behind the curtain burned the same weak glow, and the silhouette remained slender still, but the second shadow grew taller, broader, sometimes stooping, as though it carried weight upon its back. And once the curtain fluttered aside just enough to show a pale face looking down expressionless, yet the eyes were two different colors, and neither belonged to her. On the eve of a winter storm, a loud sound came from the attic like wood, tearing followed by a rush of cold air. The servants found the landing wet as though something had spilled from within, though the door stayed locked. All night the lamp flickered faster than a heartbeat, and the humming turned into a low chant. Dawn, the villagers saw a dark shape at the window pressed against the glass, as if begging release or offering a warning. Since that night, no light has burned in the attic, but at certain hours the curtain still stirs. And if you stand beneath the gable and listen, you can hear two breaths drawing in and out unevenly. Some swear they see a face at the window, veiled and pale, and behind it a hand rising as if to caress her hair. Others see only the shadow of a cord dangling like a noose swaying. Though no breeze moves, if you ever climb those stairs, you may find the door unlocked and a mirror waiting. In it you might see yourself standing not alone, but with another shape leaning close, its lips at your ear. And before you can turn, you may feel a stitch pulled tight at your wrist, a black thread winding into your skin. The door will close behind you without a sound, and the attic will gain another bride. In the drawing room hung a mirror, older than the house itself, a slab of dark silver framed in carved oak, whose edges curled like dried tongues. No one knew who had brought it there, for its weight was such that 4 men could not lift it, yet one. Winter night it had appeared as though the house had grown it from its own walls. Its surface was not smooth, but faintly rippled like water under ice, and when you looked into it, you felt as if you were standing at the bottom of a well staring up at a stranger who stared back down. The bride had been forbidden to enter the drawing room, yet she came at dusk when the servants were gone, drawn by a pull she could not name. She stood before the mirror, her veil falling aside, and saw herself, pale and thin, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. But as the candlelight shifted, the glass grew darker, and another face appeared beside hers, not a reflection, but a twin conjoined at the temple, staring with eyes that were almost but not quite the same. Its lips moved without sound, and she felt a shiver across her scalp, as if the words were being whispered inside her skull. She returned night after night, unable to resist, and each time the other face grew clearer. Sometimes it was her brother's, features faintly overlaid upon her own. Sometimes it was the child she had never held. Sometimes it was a stranger, whose mouth curved into a smile she could not mimic. When she reached out, the glass pulsed under her palms, soft as skin, yet cold as stone, and for a moment her hand seemed to sink into it up to the wrist. She pulled back gasping and saw dark marks on her fingers like soot, though she had touched nothing but silver. The servants began to avoid the drawing room after sunset. They said, the mirror whispered in a voice like water running under floorboards, a voice that spoke names they did not know. Once a footman lingered to listen, and the next morning he was gone, leaving only his gloves on the hearth. Another claimed he saw a small white hand press against the inside of the glass, then vanish, leaving a smear that faded like breath. The brother, too, came to stand before it, his palms raised as if blessing or commanding his reflection. In the glass his image wavered, and behind him appeared the bride kneeling, though she was not there in the room. He smiled faintly and traced the sigil from the chapel on the glass, his finger leaving a trail that glowed and then sank inward. That night, the mirror darkened so completely that the candles showed no flame within it, only a depthless shadow shifting like something alive. The bride began to speak to the mirror softly at first, then louder her words, a mixture of prayer and confession. She told it of the bruises beneath, her lace of the cord tightening at her wrist, of the cradle that rocked though it held no child. She asked the other face if it could help her, and it nodded, though its mouth never moved, and she began to feel its presence behind her when she turned, corners, a breath on her neck, a hand on her shoulder, though no one stood there. One evening the storm lamps blew out and she found herself alone with the mirror in near darkness. It glowed faintly from within, as if lit by moonlight under water, and she saw not her own image, but a hallway stretching away lined with doors. From behind the doors came muffled cries, laughter, whispers like insects, and a low humming that made her stomach twist. She leaned closer, and the hallway seemed to tilt toward her like a throat swallowing. She awoke on the floor with dust in her hair and a thread of blood at the corner of her mouth. The mirror was still before her, but a crack now ran across its silver backing like a vein. Through it, she glimpsed for an instant a cradle swaying in a room of shadows and a cord of braided hair coiling across the floor like a living thing. Then the crack sealed itself, leaving only her own face staring back wide-eyed and pale. After that, she covered the mirror with a heavy cloth, but at night the cloth shifted as if something inside pushed outward. Sometimes she heard a knocking from behind it, slow and deliberate like a heartbeat. Sometimes the cloth bulged outward in the shape of a hand, pressing from the other side. And always she dreamed of standing in that hallway lined with doors, unable to remember which one led back. The villagers whispered that the mirror did not show truth or lies, but the knot that bound the family together. They said it's silver. Backing was mixed with ash and salt and something else dug from beneath the chapel before it drowned. They warned each other not to look into it for too long, for it would not only reflect, but remember. And once it remembered you, it would begin. To pull on the eve of the anniversary, she stood before it one last time, the cloth fallen away, the candles burning low. Her reflection smiled at her, though her own mouth was still her reflection. Reached out, though her own hands hung at her sides. And as she watched, the glass rippled, and two faces merged hers and the other into one shape with four eyes staring back. A faint cracking sounded like ice on a thawing river, and the surface bulged outward. Something pale began to push through, a forehead, a hand, a mouth open in silent breath. She could not move her feet rooted to the carpet, as the mirror exhaled a cold wind that smelled of salt and iron. The lamp guttered out, and in the darkness she felt a fingertip brush her lips from the inside of the glass. A voice whispered a name she had never told, and the cloth flew upward as if lifted by unseen hands, covering them both in shadow. On the night of their union's anniversary, the mansion changed its breath as if something deep in its walls inhaled and held it waiting. The candles along the corridors did not flicker, but bent in one direction, as though drawn by a tide, and the air tasted of ash and brine. At the long table in the dining hall, black cloth had been laid, not velvet, not silk, but a weave, rough as funeral rope, and damp to the touch. Upon it stood no silver, no china, only plates of dark stone, sweating with cold. A chalice of tarnished golden knives whose blades curved like hooks. No guest had been invited, yet chairs were placed for 12, each one carved with a different face, none of which could be matched to living memory. Above the table hung a chandelier, of antlers bound with wire, each point dripping wax that smelled faintly of burnt hair. Somewhere in the upper floors a cradle rocked its rhythm, echoing down the stair like a drumbeat, guiding them toward the hall, and when the bride descended, she felt the cord at her wrist tighten, as if leading her hand in a dance she could not refuse. She wore no veil, only a gown of grey that clung like damp paper and left streaks on the stone steps. The brother walked beside her, but did not look at her, his hands clasped as though in prayer, yet his knuckles white with strain. The servants who followed carried covered dishes, though none had cooked them, and the lids trembled slightly, as if what lay beneath shifted. They set them down in silence, and withdrew, leaving only their shadows stretched long across the walls. When the lids were lifted, there was no meat that could be named, only shapes that resembled hearts, lungs, tongues, but none from any beast they knew. Each piece glistened with sheen not of fat, but of memory, a smell rising like childhood rooms, like lullabies half forgotten. The bride touched one with the tip of her finger and felt a tremor run up her arm, a series of images, faces, places, names she had never heard yet, recognized. The brother murmured a prayer under his breath, a string of syllables not from scripture but from the marsh chapel whispered backward. They ate slowly for each bite, tasted of something lost, each swallow heavy with a weight that was not food. The knives left black scratches on the stone plates that glowed faintly, and then faded like dying fireflies. At the head of the table sat an empty chair, and upon its plate lay a braid of hair coiled like a snake, tied at both ends. The bride stared at it, feeling her pulse match its spiral, and for a moment she heard a child humming from somewhere very close. A door opened at the far end of the hall, though no one had touched it, and a wind swept in, carrying the smell of salt and iron. In the doorway stood no person, but a shadow shaped like a person, its edges frayed as if woven from smoke. It raised a hand, and the chandelier's wax dripped faster, the antlers creaking as though under strain. The brother rose, bowed his head, and spoke a name the bride had never heard, but felt in her bones like a bruise. One by one the chairs filled with shapes pale and indistinct, like photographs left in water. Each took a seat and laid its hands on the table, hands that were too long, too thin yet familiar in some hidden way. They began to speak in low murmurs, not words but the sound of names being tasted and swallowed, names rising from the plates and fading on their tongues. The bride tried to rise, but the cord at her wrist held her fast, and the brother's hand pressed gently on her shoulder, not cruel but firm as stone. He leaned close, his breath cold, and whispered that this was the feast, where memory became flesh, where the family fed upon its own, to keep the thread unbroken. She felt tears sting her eyes, but they were dark, not clear, leaving streaks like ink down her cheeks. The shadow at the door entered, gliding without feet, and sat at the empty chair, laying its hand upon the braid of hair. The chandelier flickered, and for a heartbeat she saw that each guest wore her face, though older, younger male, female, all variations of herself folded inward. She tried to speak, but her tongue felt heavy as though stitched, and the taste of ash filled her mouth. The brother took the chalice and held it to her lips, and though she turned away, a drop fell onto her tongue. She gasped as images flooded her. The marsh, the chapel, the loom, the mirror, the attic, the cradle, all woven into one knot, tightening, and she understood that the meat on the plates was not flesh but names, each bite a memory consumed so it could never be spoken again. The guests began to vanish one by one, leaving behind only a faint red thread curling across the table toward her. It wound around, her fingers warm and alive, pulsing with the beat of her own heart. She tried to pull away, but the thread sank beneath her skin, vanishing, leaving only a mark shaped like the sigil from the chapel. The brother smiled faintly and whispered that now she belonged to the lineage, not by vow, not by blood, but by name. The chandelier's antlers cracked and fell to the floor, with a sound like bones breaking, and the candles went out, leaving the hall in darkness. In that darkness she felt hands, not one, not two, but many, sliding across her shoulders. Her arms, her face, all whispering her name at once. She screamed, but no sound came, only a low humming rising from her chest, matching the cradle's rhythm above, and in the last flicker of the dying candles she saw the plates empty, the braid of hair gone, and the shadow at the head of the table smiling without a mouth. In the highest room of the house, a cradle rocked where no hands pushed it, its pale wood older than the mansion itself, carved with symbols that had blurred into veins. The floor around it was strewn with salt and ash and threads of black hair, as if the loom from the attic had unraveled and spilled its secret downward. No one had ever seen a child inside, yet its bedding bore the imprint of a small body, and each dawn a faint warmth rose from it, like the breath of something sleeping. The servants would creep to the door and press their ears to the panel and hear a low humming, not hers, not his, but something born between them, rising and falling like a tide, drawn by a hidden moon. The bride would climb the stairs at night, her candle trembling, casting ribs of light across the walls. She would kneel beside the cradle and whisper lullabies, though she did not know to whom she spoke. Sometimes a tiny hand would rise from the blankets, pale as wax fingers spread like roots reaching toward her, but when she tried to take it, her hands closed on nothing. Other nights a shadow bent over the cradle, darker than the room itself, its outline shifting as if made of wings and reeds and salt mist. The brother forbade anyone to enter, yet he himself lingered at the threshold, his palms pressed flat against the door, his lips moving without sound. He would trace the sigil from the chapel into the dust on the floor, and the cradle would rock harder, its humming deepening until the walls quivered, Once the bride woke to find a cord braided from her own hair tied to the cradle's leg. The other end wound around her wrist, sinking into her skin like a worm. She tried to cut it, but the blade bent, and the cord only pulsed faster, like a second heartbeat under her flesh. The villagers spoke of a legend older than the house of a child never born, but always waiting a child that could only exist in shadow until called by a name never spoken aloud. They said the cradle was its gate, its cocoon its anchor, and that each generation the family fed it with vows and memories until it grew strong enough to reach out. On certain nights, a thin cry rose from the chimney drifting over the moor, a sound like wind in reeds yet carrying, syllables that made dogs hide and birds fall silent. Those who heard it in their sleep woke with their mouths full of salt and their dreams threaded with a red line. They could not follow one winter storm. The bride found the cradle empty, the blankets folded but damp as though something had slipped free. In their place lay a small mirror clouded with breath and a single tooth white as moonstone tied to it with a thread. She held it to her face and for an instant saw not her reflection, but a featureless mask where her face should be, and behind it a mouth opening wide. She dropped it, and the mirror cracked without sound, the thread coiling like a living thing across the floor and vanishing into the shadows. After that the humming followed. Her wherever she went, curling around her like a low tide, she could not escape. The lamps dimmed when she entered a room, and the mirrors fogged, though no heat touched them. Sometimes she glimpsed a small shape at the end of the corridor, wrapped in mourning veils, its hands clutching the braided cord, dragging it along the boards. When she tried to approach it, turned its head, though it had no face, only smooth, pale skin like wax. And then it was gone, leaving a smell of iron and milk. The brother began to speak in his sleep, calling a name she had never heard but felt in the roots of her teeth. He would wake with his palms bleeding small crescents under his nails, as if he had clawed at something unseen. The cradle, meanwhile, rocked on its own even at noon, casting long shadows that crawled up the walls like black vines. And beneath its movement, a soft clicking grew like insects, hatching like beads, slipping on a string, on the eve of the new century. The bride entered the room to find the cradle still, the air heavy and cold. She leaned over it and saw a depression in the mattress, shaped like a child, curled but empty. Then a breath rose from beneath her feet, from the cracks of the floor, and the humming began inside her chest, vibrating her bones. A thin voice whispered at her ear, a name she had never told, a name she realized belonged to her, yet was not hers. She staggered back and saw in the corner of the room a small figure wrapped in veils, holding the cord between, its hands twisting it slowly. It raised its head, though no face showed, and a second smaller cord slid from its fingers toward her ankles, pulsing like a vein. The lamp flickered, and for a heartbeat, she saw herself standing in the cradle, arms crossed. Like a swaddled infant, the veiled child looking down at her, and as the cord tightened, she felt the floor tilt as though the room itself had become a cradle, rocking with her inside. The humming deepened until it was no longer sound, but weight pressing her to the boards. In the doorway, the brother stood unmoving, his hands at his sides, eyes fixed on nothing, lips parted as if waiting for her to speak. But she could make no sound, only watch as the veiled child reached toward her, a hand without fingers, brushing the air between them. And when the candle died, the last thing she saw was the cradle rocking again, though nothing lay within, and the cord snaking across the floor toward the door as if to find its next bearer. Beneath a sky the color of wet slate, the village huddled against the moor, its cottages like teeth worn down by centuries, their chimneys leaning like tired sentries, no smoke rising, though fires burned within. There had always been stories of the mansion on the hill, but over time the stories thinned, became whispers, became coughs, and finally became nothing. Yet the unease remained like the smell of iron after a storm. Old parish books that once listed the names of the family were gone, eaten by mildew, or lost in fires whose sparks no one remembered striking. Yet every wall bore faint scorch marks like fingertips pressed too long. Portraits that had hung in the town hall vanished one by one. Frames left empty glass, clouded with frost, as though breath had been trapped behind it and then drained away. Even gravestones dissolved their inscriptions, running like ink in rain, until only blank stone stood in the churchyard. Rows of teeth with no names attached, the wind slipping through, them like a voice half swallowed. At first the villagers tried to recall the names, tried to tell the old stories around their tables, but each time the words twisted, slid away, became other names or no names at all. A midwife who had once delivered, a pale child at the mansion's edge, woke one morning unable to remember the path to the house, or the shape of the infant she had cradled. A priest who had blessed the couple stood in his pulpit and found his sermon full of holes like moth-eaten, cloth his tongue heavy with salt. In every throat a superstition remained a splinter of bone that could not be coughed up, and it itched at them, especially at night when the wind came down from the hill, carrying a hum they did not dare name. The market square grew quieter. The bells stopped tolling and the clock in the tower lost its hands, but no one wound it or missed it. Children played at the edge of the moor, stacking stones into little cairns without knowing why, singing a rhyme of which only one line survived the rest eaten by silence. Sometimes at dusk a shape crossed the lane between cottages, a small figure draped in mourning veils dragging a cord of braided hair behind it, and the dogs shrank under carts, while the adults stared at the ground pretending not to see. Each who glimpsed it forgot the moment after but woke with salt on their tongues and a dream of empty cradles rocking. One winter, a traveling historian came to the village asking about the mansion and its line, and the people looked at him with blank eyes as if he had asked about a country that had never existed. He pressed them, tried to draw maps from their memories, but the paper remained white beneath his pen, the ink refusing to flow. That night he climbed the hill himself, and by morning his footprints had filled with black water, and the villagers could not recall his face, or why there were 2 extra horses at the inn. Only the midwife, who still felt the splinter of bone under her tongue, whispered to her mirror that the hill had eaten him as it would eat them all. The mansion itself seemed to lean closer to the village, as though the earth beneath it shifted its gables, staring like blind eyes, the windows fogged with breath. That never cleared. Sometimes a faint toll drifted down, though the church up there had long been roofless, a bell swinging without ropes, its tongue striking nothing, yet sounding like a heart against a rib cage. Inside the cottages, mirrors cracked, in their frames, and spoons bent in bowls, as though something heavy had leaned on them for a moment and then moved on. And in the silence that followed, the villagers felt lighter, as if some memory had been lifted from them, a weight they could not name removed. But leaving a bruise on the eve of the harvest festival, the villagers tried to hold their old procession, but the road curved away from the hill like a worm recoiling. Lanterns dimmed, no matter how much oil was poured into them, and the fiddler's bow found only silence when it touched the strings. At the edge of the square, a cradle sat where no one had placed it. Its wood, pale and veined, rocking slowly, though no wind blew, a faint humming rising from it that matched the one. That haunted their dreams. The mayor reached to stop it, but his hand froze inches away and his lips moved with a name he had never told, and when he blinked, the cradle was gone, leaving only a small tooth white as moonstone in the dust. After that night they stopped trying to remember, stopped speaking of the mansion or the family or the cradle, as though silence itself might save them. But still in every throat, the superstition remained a taste of salt, a flicker of black water at the edge, of the eye a hum under the floorboards, and on certain nights when the mist from the moor rolled down and swallowed the square, the villagers swore they could see the veiled child standing in the church doorway, holding the braided cord, waiting. They would close their shutters, but the humming seeped through the walls and into their bones, pressing on their ribs like small hands until dawn. By the time the century turned, no maps marked the village. The road ended at a stand of crooked birches, and beyond that, only moor and mist travelers who stumbled through spoke of a place where their watches stopped, and their names slipped from their minds like coins into water. They spoke of cottages with no doors, of bells swinging in roofless, towers of a cradle rocking at the crossroads where no wind stirred, and each story ended with the same image, a small faceless child wrapped in veils dragging a cord behind it across the stones into the fog as the last elder of the village sat by her fire. She felt the splinter of bone finally rise to her tongue, and she coughed it into her palm, a tiny tooth white as moonstone tied with a thread. She opened her door to throw it into the night, but on her threshold stood the veiled child holding out its hand. The cord of braided hair between them pulsed like a living vein, and as she stared it began to coil around her fingers, tightening, drawing her into the mist. Behind her the fire went out, though no wind had entered, and the humming rose into a low chant as the door swung shut. On the 12th night of frost, when the moon rose like a cracked plate over the moor, the mansion exhaled a mist that rolled down toward the empty village, carrying with it a sound like lullabies sung backward, a low humming stitched with whispers. Inside the great hall the bride sat alone, her hands folded on her knees, feeling the braided cord wound around her wrists, pulse like a second heartbeat. She had not untied it since the cradle vanished. It seemed to grow tighter each day, drinking her warmth. The brother stood at the far end of the room, motionless, eyes clouded as if he stared at a mirror turned inward, his lips moving without sound, the sigil from the chapel faintly visible beneath his skin like a bruise. All around them, portraits, hung, but their faces had melted into pale ovals, their frames dripping resin as though the house itself had begun to forget its own. Only the windows remembered, and in their panes a small shape appeared night after night, draped in mourning veils, its outline the size of a child, its presence older than stone. The servants had fled long ago, but sometimes footsteps echoed in the corridor, soft as moth wings pacing toward the nursery where the cradle had been. Doors swelled shut in the damp, yet opened when no hand touched them. Curtains swayed as if brushed by fingers made of mist. Each night the humming grew louder, not in the air, but inside the bride's ribs, a vibration of bone and salt, her own voice beginning to echo it without her. Will she would rise from her bed, drawn toward the staircase candle, shaking as the hall stretched longer than it should, her shadow bending at strange angles across the tiles on. The 13th night she reached the landing, and there it stood at the threshold of the nursery, a small figure wrapped in veils dragging the cord across the floor behind it, the sound of the braid on the wood like a snake shedding skin. It turned its head, though no face showed, only smooth, pale wax, and where a mouth might be a faint dent pulsing as though it breathed. She whispered, "Who are you?" but the words fell back into her throat and emerged as a lullaby she did not know. The figure raised a hand without fingers, beckoning her toward the dark cradle. She could not see but felt waiting beyond the door. The brother appeared behind her, his hands outstretched, but his eyes were gone, two hollows of shadow, his voice a rasp of prayer bruising the air. He spoke a name she had never heard yet knew, belonged to her blood. And as he spoke, the veiled child swayed, humming louder, the walls of the mansion trembling like a drum. Plaster cracked down the staircase, the sigil from the chapel glowing faintly on each step, as if burned there by unseen feet. A cord slithered across the landing toward her ankles, curling like a vine, like an umbilicus returning to its root. She tried to flee, but the corridor stretched into a tunnel lined with mirrors, each reflecting her, not as she was, but as a swaddled infant, eyes, black mouth open in a soundless cry. Behind the glass something crawled thin, and many-jointed, pressing against the silver backing, its limbs like reeds, its face a mask of veils. As she stumbled, the veiled child drew nearer, its humming, now words half-formed syllables that pricked her ears like needles, naming things that had no names. The air thickened with the smell of iron and milk, a scent of birth and burial together. When she reached the door of the nursery, it swung open without touch, revealing the cradle at its center, rocking slowly, though no wind stirred its wood, pale and veined, the blankets damp as though something had just risen from them. On the floor lay a mirror, clouded with breath, and tied to it a tooth white, as moonstone, its thread trailing toward the child. The bride bent to pick it up, but her reflection showed the veiled child standing behind her, faceless hands on her shoulders, and her own mouth opening wider, wider, until it was only darkness. She dropped the mirror, and it cracked without sound, the fragments sliding like water across the boards, forming the sigil from the chapel. The veiled child stepped into the room, the cord tightening between them, pulsing like a living vein, its head tilted, as though listening to a heart deep underground. It reached out and brushed her cheek with a hand that was not a hand, but a curl of mist, cold and soft, leaving a smear of salt. The brother whispered again the name, and the walls bowed inward beams, groaning as though the mansion itself was breathing. She felt the cord slide up her arms across her throat around her ribs, not binding but pulling as if to draw something out from inside her. In the doorway she glimpsed the village far below, though. No window stood there, cottages dissolving into fog bells, tolling without towers, a cradle rocking at the crossroads, children with blank faces, stacked stones singing the one surviving line of the rhyme, while the veiled child dragged its cord from one to another, threading them like beads. She realized the cord that bound her wrist was the same cord trailing through the village, through the graves, through the mouths of those who had forgotten a single thread, stitching memory into silence. And now it had returned to its source, pulling her toward the cradle, toward the name she had never spoken aloud. The humming swelled until it filled her skull, her teeth, her bones, until she could not tell if she breathed or the house breathed or the child breathed. The veiled figure climbed into the cradle, though it never bent its knees, simply rose and settled like mist, its faceless head turning toward her. It extended both arms, and the cord went slack between them, then tightened around, her waist drawing her step by step closer until she stood at the cradle's edge. Inside the blankets a shape moved like a heartbeat, like wings trying to unfold. She leaned over and saw not a child, but her own face, smoothed, blank, eyes closed, mouth sealed by a stitch of hair, and when it opened its eyes they were black and old. The veiled child whispered without a mouth, the sound inside her skull, "Welcome back," and the cord snapped tight. The candle died, and in the dark she felt herself lifted, as though swaddled, the cradle rocking faster, the hum becoming a chant older than language. In the last flicker of moonlight the brother fell to his knees, hands covering his hollow eyes as the house tilted and the floor rolled like a tide, carrying her and the faceless child together into the cradle. Midnight came like a slow tide, rising through the floorboards of the ruined chapel. The bell that had not hung there for 100 years, tolling once, twice, without ropes, without metal. The sound a pulse in the air and in the blood of those who still remembered without knowing what they remembered. At the altar the bride stood veiled in the same mourning cloth as the child, her hands bound by a cord of braided hair, dark and pale strands woven together, the cord moving on its own, like a living vein tightening, loosening, tightening again, a breath or a heartbeat. The brother knelt at her side, his eyes hollow as coins, his palms pressed to the stone, his lips shaping prayers that turned to salt on his tongue, his voice a rasp that sounded like a blade drawn across wet wood. Around them the pews were filled with shapes neither living nor dead, shadows of villagers who had forgotten themselves. Faces, blank hands clasped as if in witness, though no memory of this union lived inside them. Above the altar hung the mirror from the drawing room, cracked into 1,000 facets each, showing not what stood before it, but some hidden image of what had been and what would be, wings, hands, cradles, graves, all sliding over one another in silver. The bell tolled again, and the cord pulled the bride toward the altar, step by step, her feet leaving no prints on the dust. The veiled child walking backward ahead of her, drawing her in like a fisherman with a line. The humming that had lived in her. Ribs for months rose into her throat and spilled from her mouth, not as a cry but as a chant, older than the language of the village, a chant that unrolled like a black ribbon over the stone floor. The brother rose to stand behind her, his hands hovering over the cord as though to cut it, but each time he touched it, his fingers bled small crescents of flesh curling away like petals, and the cord only pulsed faster. She turned her veiled head toward him and whispered a name without sound, the name. He had been trying to remember the name that had splintered into every throat of the village, and now returned whole, a name that meant both birth and burial. The shadows in the pews leaned forward, though they had no faces, and in their leaning the chapel walls bowed inward, beams bending like ribs, the air thick with the scent of iron and milk. The mirror above the altar flared silver, and in its facets she saw herself and the veiled child as twins conjoined by the cord, moving not as two but as one creature pulling itself together across a gulf of generations. The cord looped once, twice around her wrists and then around her throat, its strands tightening like hair caught in a turning wheel, yet not choking her, only drawing something. Up from inside her chest, something cold and bright like a tooth of ice. When it surfaced, she gasped, and a soundless infant cry filled the chapel, rattling the empty windows, making the bell swing, though it had no clapper. The brother seized a shard of the mirror and tried to slice the cord, but the shard bent like lead, and his hand split at the palms, red and white mingling on the stone. He fell to his knees, murmuring, "Cut, cut, cut." But the word dissolved into ash before it left his mouth, and the cord wrapped around his wrists too, pulling him closer until he knelt at her feet, bound like a supplicant. The veiled child stepped onto the altar, its faceless head tilted back, its arms spread wide, the cord now running from its hands to hers, to every shadow in the pews, a single braided vein stitching them into one body. The bell tolled a third time, not with sound but with weight, a pressure on the ribs of all present, and the chapel doors swung inward, letting the mist from the more pour across the floor like milk in that mist. The villagers' shadows rose and began to sway their blank faces, turning toward the altar, their mouths opening. Though no words came, only the hum that had lived under their tongues for years. The bride lifted her bound hands, and the cord moved with her, coiling tighter, yet also loosening as though something inside it was slipping free, a knot being tied, even as another was undone. She felt her own face smoothing blank behind the veil, her own mouth sealed by hair yet inside it, a whisper older than speech crawling out like a child from a cradle. She looked at the brother and saw his hollow eyes fill with black water, saw the cord pulse between them like an umbilicus between twin hearts, and she knew then it could never be cut. The mist rose to the ceiling, and when it fell again, the pews were empty, the shadows gone, the villagers forgotten once more. Only the bride, the brother, and the veiled child remained at the altar, the cord binding them glistening as if wet with birth water, tightening and loosening like breath. The mirror cracked completely, the shards sliding down like falling leaves, cutting the cord in 100 places, yet each piece of hair writhed and grew, and joined itself again, weaving a knot in mid-air. That knot hung above them, glowing faintly, a tangle of memory and salt, a thing that was not a thing, and as they stared, it pulsed once, twice like a heart. The bell tolled a final time, and the doors slammed shut, the mist curling back into the walls, leaving the chapel silent, except for the slow tightening of the knot. The bride lifted her veiled head to it, and in that moment the veil fell away, revealing not her face, but the smooth, waxen mask of the child without a face. She reached up and touched the knot with both hands, and it moved, sliding down around her arms, her shoulders, her heart closing like a fist. The brother tried to cry out, but his voice was gone, his mouth full of salt and hair, his eyes blind to everything but the glowing knot. And as the last candle died, the knot tightened once more, drawing all three of them into a single pulse, and then the chapel shuddered like a cradle, rocked by invisible hands, somewhere far below. In the empty village, a cradle began to rock at the crossroads, though no wind stirred its pale wood, older than the mansion itself, carved with symbols blurred into veins. The hum rose again, a low chant spilling from every throat of those who had forgotten, a chant that would not end now that the knot had been tied. And in the final darkness of the chapel, the knot moved as if alive, tightening, tightening, until it vanished into the space between heartbeats, leaving only the sound of the bell, tolling without metal, without rope, without end.